All right, guys, so we barely got started on the topic of global population. And so we started this by looking at the National Geographic video, which again is a few years old, and it talks about reaching 7 billion people. And so you've got notes on that already. We're going to move on to, we only did the first video if I recall, right? So we're going to move on to this next video by NPR. So again, I want to remind you that you want to take good notes because all of this is going to be fair content.
A 1,000 years ago, there were only 1/3 of a billion people, but we were multiplying. Now there's 7 billion of us. How did we grow so much, so fast? Say this glass is North America. The fuller the glass gets, the more people there are. Water drips in as people are born. Water drips out as people die. Okay, here's the entire world. Now let's go back 1,000 years. The Americas are nearly empty. Europe and Africa have less than 100 million people between them. And just like today, most people live in China, India, and the rest of Asia. For centuries, things stay pretty much the same. Births are canceled out by deaths. Women are having lots of babies, but most babies die before they grow up and have families of their own. We don't reach 1 billion until 1804. But things are changing. Better medicine and better agriculture are starting to slow the leak from the bottom of the glass. People still die, of course, but more babies grow up and have babies of their own. Lots of babies. We've grown from 1 billion to 7 billion, and it only took 200 years. Will we keep going like this? Probably not. The UN says we'll level out at 10 billion by the end of the century. So as we continue to grow from 7 billion, the question is, can the world hold that many people? Experts can't agree. It all depends on how well we manage our food, water, and energy.
All right, so guys, what was it, did they say, that kept population growth low?
High death rate.
So high death rates. So what did we learn? Initially, we see lower population growth because birth rates and death rates are on the same level, right? So if you have birth rates and death rates that are on the same level, you don't see much population growth. But then what did we learn? What innovations changed that dynamic? So medicine and different agricultural practices. So with medicine, what happened to infant mortality, guys? Infant mortality drops, right? Infant mortality drops. So people are still having a lot of children, but instead of losing a number of those children, they're all growing up. That starts driving the increase in population. So we've exceeded 7 billion people. What do experts predict population is going to max at? 10 billion people. So people aren't suggesting that we're going to kind of just continuously grow and grow and grow. That we're going to kind of somehow get to 10 billion and things are going to level out. Maybe there'll be some feedback mechanisms that keep growth low at that point. So remind me, guys, then, how long did it take us to get from 1 billion people to 7 billion people?
200 years.
200 years, right? 200 years. Good. So one thing that we want to look at, guys, is the influence of decreasing birth rate. And of course, if people don't change their procreation habits, what happens? Yeah, you start getting population explosions, right? You still have large families, but children aren't dying. Children are surviving. All right, great. So that was NPR. Let's continue. So 7 billion, are you typical?
I can't believe it.
What, did that promotion give Kevin a big head?
No, I can't believe how easy it was to save with Geico.
So what did we learn about the typical person? And of course that's looking across the globe's population, averaging everyone together. How much are they making? Is it in the 25,000s, 30,000s? What's typical? Less than $12,000, right? So we're in a very high income country, and those of us that live in the developed world, but we have to remember that a lot of the world is developing much, much lower incomes. So less than $12,000 a year for the average income. What else did we learn about that person?
28.
They're going to be 28, right? So we have a median age of 28. We have some countries that have very, very low population pyramids. In other words, they have a population skewed towards very, very young. Of course, we do have some that are skewed towards very, very old. So ours is skewing towards older, right? But you have some very, very young countries. Do they have cell phones? Yeah, so they have cell phones. And guys, cell phones have become a lot more commonplace. I just took a group to the Amazon jungle, and you can go to the Amazon jungle in the indigenous communities with indigenous tribes living in huts in the Amazon with no electricity, except for, a very rudimentary electricity here and there, and they have cell phones. So cell phones are very common. But what about banking? Is that person in the Amazon jungle going to have a place where he can store his wealth safely? No. So a lot of people have cell phones because that's become important for communication. It's hard to have employment without cell phones. People need to be able to contact you. You need to be able to communicate with people. But that doesn't necessarily mean you'll have modern banking facilities. So the average person is male. Is our population overwhelmingly male though? No, so it's just barely male, right? So majority is male, but just barely. Median age we said was 28. What did we learn was the biggest ethnic group in our globe? The Han Chinese tribe, right? Han Chinese. So we don't want to just say Chinese because that would not be specific enough. So Han Chinese, right? But H-A-N. H-A-N. Han Chinese. But what did we learn? Is that going to be true in another number of years? By 2030, that typical person's no longer Han Chinese. They're what? They're going to be Indian, right? We see life expectancy being really different across the globe. What example did they give us? 45 for who?
Afghanistan.
So if you are from Afghanistan, your life expectancy might be 45, and we compared that to who? A Japanese woman with a life expectancy in Japan, obviously a Japanese woman in Japan, duh, and her life expectancy is 86, right? So we see some really big discrepancies in life expectancy. Last thing they really talked about was water use, right? Water use. What did we learn about water use? Yeah, we use a lot of water in this country. The average person in the United States uses 100 gallons a day, guys. Think about just how much water that is, 100 gallons a day. A typical hot tub, like a big hot tub, might be like 500 gallons of water. So you're talking about every 5 days you are filling up a hot tub full of water and using it. But if you go to more arid parts of Ethiopia, where water is going to be more scarce, how much water are they using? So in the bush areas of Ethiopia, we're not necessarily talking about in the cities, they're using what? 2.5 gallons, right? And to get that 2.5 gallons, what do they have to do? Yeah, they might spend several hours in the process of simply collecting water. And I've actually seen that. I took a group in the Dominican Republic, and we went to communities that were Haitian, and they were basically kind of, to some degree, enslaved sugar workers because they had been lured there to take sugar jobs, and then their passports were taken and they're documentless, basically. But we were in communities where to get water, they're walking 2 hours. They had no water facilities, no rivers, no streams, anything nearby. So, very different standards of living. But the average person, guys, does the average person look like us? Average person doesn't resemble us all that much, right? We have much higher incomes, longer life expectancies, modern banking. They don't look like us physically, right? All right.
It's official. There are now 7 billion people on Earth. And projections show we'll top 8 billion just 12 years from now. What's going on? How did we get here? Well, to understand population growth, we should really start at the beginning. Turns out it took all of human history, about 50,000 years, up to the year 1800 to reach the first billion inhabitants. But once we hit that mark, things started to move. The number doubled to 2 billion in just 130 years. 2 billion became 3 billion just 30 years later. It took 14 years to go from 3 billion to 4 billion, and we reached 5 billion 13 years later. You can see what's happening. 12 years later, we're at 6 billion, and another 12 years after that, we've reached 7 billion. What is surprising is that over the past 50 years, the actual growth rate has slowed, yet the size of the world's population continues to rise. So how can both things be happening? To find the answer, we have to go back a few hundred years. Profound changes were happening. The Industrial Revolution transformed the way people lived and worked. With improved economic conditions, people lived longer. Then in the 20th century, better sanitation and modern medicine extended life even further. And family life began to change. Women's roles expanded. There was greater access to modern contraception, and more kids were enrolled in school. All this led to smaller families and longer lives. This is what experts call a demographic transition that marks the shift in birth and death rates. So what does it mean on a global scale? To understand global, we actually have to think local. That's because demographic transitions happen country by country. And at any given time, the world contains a mix of countries that are in various stages of transition. In the early phase of the demographic transition, both birth rates and death rates are high. These countries generally have very young populations and fewer older citizens. But as countries develop, living conditions improve and people live longer. Birth rates, however, are still high, so population growth is still rising. Now look at countries that have transitioned even further. Life expectancy goes up while people have fewer children, but the population is still growing because of the greater number of people at younger ages. At the end of the transition, most population growth is stabilized with low birth and death rates. And in some cases, the population actually declines because there are more deaths than births, which gets us back to the original question. Why is world population still rising even though the actual growth rate has slowed? The simple answer is because right now we're at a point in history where there are still more people living in countries in early transition with growing populations than people living in countries with stable or declining populations. So there you have it. 7 billion today and 8 billion projected in another 12 years. Understanding how and why the world's population is growing will help nations better plan for the future and for future generations.
So I know that was a lot and he went fast, so we will debrief that really quickly. All right, so first thing he was talking about was this J-curve pattern we've been talking about with respect to population growth. So what did we learn? How many years did it take us to get the first 1 billion people? How many? 50,000 years. So the first 1 billion people on the earth, it took us 50,000 years to get the first 1 billion people, right? How many years did it take us to get the second 1 billion people? 130, right? Dramatic change there. 50,000 years to get the first 1 billion people, but only 130 years to get the second 1 billion people. And then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. How many years did it take us to get the sixth 1 billion people? Anyone get that down? The sixth, 12 years, guys, to get the sixth 1 billion people. And what about the seventh 1 billion people? How many years? 7. 7 years. So I'm skipping some years, but it went from 50,000 for the first 1 billion to 130 for the second 1 billion, and then it was 30 years for the third 1 billion. Go a little bit longer, 12 years for the sixth 1 billion, 6 years for the seventh 1 billion. So what does that tell us? The amount of time it has taken us to add 1 billion people to the earth has done what? Has shrunk, has gotten shorter, and not just a little shorter, quickly it has gotten shorter, rapidly shorter, like it's rapidly decreased in terms of the time it takes us to get another 1 billion people. Yeah?
In the first Nat Geo video we watched last Thursday, it said in 1999 we had 6 billion, and in 2011 we had 7 billion.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
Yeah, they probably.
So let's see, let's figure out this discrepancy. So it said 1999 we had 6 billion, 2011 we had 7 billion, which would
That
be
was 12 years, right?
12 years, yeah. So I wonder if, that's a good question. I don't know. Those aren't quite consistent unless there's like a lot of rounding going on, right? But that'd be a lot of rounding. I don't know. I think though the trend that they're illustrating is still quite similar, right? So they might have shifted a 1 billion somewhere. It kind of looks like that. So I don't know. I can't answer that question. But I do think it's pretty clear, both in the first video and this video, the amount of time it's taken us to add 1 billion people has gotten much, much, much shorter.
But for the test, we won't have to know like the exact.
I'm not going to have you memorize these numbers. We're not going to memorize these numbers. None of my tests have made you memorize any facts and statistics, right? All right. So guys, this video was talking about this kind of conundrum. It said that population growth has decreased, right, across the globe. Population growth has decreased, and you're going to be doing some reading on that. But our population is still growing. Well, that makes sense as long as population growth is positive, right? You could have a population growth slowing, but as long as it's positive, right, population is going to go up. But he talked about some interesting patterns that we see emerge. So what are some of the things he listed that have contributed to this longer life expectancy and slowing population growth?
Sanitation.
Okay, improved sanitation, right? So if you've ever gone anywhere that doesn't have any kind of sanitation, where there's no where to dispose of waste, there's no collection methods, you have really unsanitary conditions, and of course that would lead to diseases. What else? So sanitation, what else?
Improved economic conditions.
So improved economic conditions, so that makes sense, right? People have a little bit higher standard of living. With that comes improvements of their housing structure, of their facilities, the way that they live on a day-to-day basis. What else?
Like education.
Okay, they talked about education. Kids are going to school and getting an education, so that's contributing to the improved economic conditions. What else?
Contraceptives.
Contraceptives, right? Contraceptives. So what does contraception do when people have access to contraception?
Slows the growth rate of births.
Slows down your birth rate, right? Contraception, access to contraception is going to decrease your birth rate, right? Decrease your birth rate. Good. And then, of course, medicine. He talked about something that we'd already talked about. So he refers to this idea as a key demographic transition, right? That was the term that he used, a key demographic transition. But what did he say? Does every single country have the same demographic transition? No, he said that it happens country by country, right? Each country might have a very different pattern or be in a different place in terms of where they are. So he basically divided this into 3 stages, right? So he talked about 3 stages. So let's summarize these 3 stages of the demographic transition that he was talking about. The early stage, how would we characterize birth rates and death rates? Birth rates are high and death rates are high. So guys, in the very early stages of this demographic transition, we're seeing high birth rates and high death rates, and we have a young population. Now guys, do we think those people have access to contraception? Probably not seeing access to contraception, right? So that's going to contribute to this high birth rate. But then we start seeing some economic growth and conditions start to improve for people. We talked about economic conditions, sanitation, having some access maybe to contraception. So conditions start to improve, but what is stage 2? How do we describe stage 2?
High birth rates.
Our birth rates are still high, right? So we want to be clear, our birth rates are still high. So when we get into that second stage of transition, probably, there could be some access to contraception, but the average person may not have access to contraception. So birth rates are still high. But we have better economic conditions. We have sanitation that's improved. We have medicine. So what happens to our death rates? Our death rates go down, right? Our death rates go down. So in stage 2, with high birth rates and low death rates, because our infant mortality rates have fallen, right? What's happening to population there? Yeah, our population is going to start getting big, right? So we're still having a lot of babies, but they're surviving. And finally, we end up in stage 3. When we get to stage 3, what does that look like? Now birth rates are falling, right? Birth rates are falling. So maybe we're getting access to contraception. Maybe we're practicing family planning. But birth rates are falling. And of course, we have death rates that have already fallen in stage 2. So what happens to some countries, did they say, in stage 3? Their population might actually what? Decrease. They might actually decrease, right? Sometimes we see 0 population growth or sometimes negative population growth for specific countries because they've gotten to stage 3. So then what was the punchline. At the end of this transition, you're sitting with low birth rates and low death rates, and things have kind of stabled out. But the reason we're not seeing that as much is because what? What was this punchline? We're still seeing countries in this early stage, right? We still have a lot of countries that are in this early stage or stage 2 of development, right? And that would probably be the developing world, right? So we have a lot of countries in the developing world that haven't made this kind of transition yet. So my guess is if we pulled data, which I have, and we look at what's going on in the developing countries versus the developed countries, are they going to look really different in their net population growth rate? Absolutely. Good. All right. Now this next guy, Hans Rosling, is a genius. Now he is not an economist. I think he's actually basically a demographer. But he is one of the world's experts on kind of describing and discussing population dynamics. And I think you're going to find him really good. We're going to watch probably more than one video from him, but he's really excellent.
I still remember the day in school when our teacher told us that the world population had become 3 billion people. And that was in 1960. And I'm going to talk now how world population has changed from that year and into the future. But I will not use digital technology as I've done during my first 5 TED Talks. Instead, I have progressed. And I am today launching a brand new analog teaching technology that I picked up from IKEA. This box contains 1 billion people. And our teacher told us that the industrialized world, 1960, had 1 billion people. And the developing world, she said, they had 2 billion people. And they lived away then. There was a big gap between the 1 billion in the industrialized world and the 2 billion in the developing world. The industrialized world, people were healthy, educated, rich, and they had small families. And their aspiration was to buy a car. And in 1960, all Swedes were saving to try to buy a Volvo like this. This was the economic level at which Sweden was. But in contrast to this, the developing world, far away, the aspiration of the average family there was to have food for the day. And they were saving to be able to buy a pair of shoes. There was an enormous gap in the world when I grew up. And this gap between the West and the rest has created a mindset of the world which we still use linguistically when we talk about the West and the developing world. But the world has changed, and it's overdue to upgrade that mindset and that taxonomy of the world and to understand it. And that's what I'm going to show you. Because since 1960, what has happened in the world up to 2010 is that a staggering 4 billion people have been added to the world population. Just look how many. The world population has doubled since I went to school. And of course there has been economic growth in the West. A lot of companies have happened to grow the economy, so the Western population moved over to here. And now their aspiration is not only to have a car, now they want to have a holiday on a very remote destination and they want to fly. So this is where they are today. And the most successful of the developing countries here, they have moved on, and they have become emerging economies, we call them. And they are now buying cars. And what happened a month ago was that the Chinese company Geely, they acquired the Volvo company. And then finally the Swedes understood that something big had happened in the world. So there they are. And the tragedy is that the 2 billion over here that is struggling for food and shoes, they are still almost as poor as they were 50 years ago. The new thing is that we have the biggest pile of billions, the 3 billions here, which are also becoming emerging economies. Because they are quite healthy, relatively well educated, and they already also have 2 to 3 children per woman, as those have. And their aspiration now is, of course, to buy a bicycle. And then later on they would like to have a motorbike also. But this is the world we have today. No longer any gap.
So guys, let's stop there and kind of debrief this, because it's important to try to get some good notes on this, and it's going to be a little bit challenging. So what is he saying about the world as it was in 1960? What is he describing? He's got boxes, but he's putting them where?
Well, there's a really big gap.
Big gap, right? So he's got boxes on the left and he's got boxes on the right. So what is he basically saying? That the world in 1960 had 2 very distinct populations. You were either in a very poor developing nation, right? Or you were in a non-poor nation. And the people in the non-poor nations are buying cars, but the people in the poor nations are buying shoes, right? What was missing in 1960 is that middle group of countries. That middle group of countries. But what do we see now? In 2010 was his now, because that's when this TED Talk was. What do we see now? What was that? Okay, so the population has gotten a lot bigger, and what used to be binary, right? You were either on the left or you're on the right, and nobody was in the middle, has become a spectrum, right? We have that middle group of countries. So who are these middle group of countries? These are those developing countries, right? Those industrializing countries. So it's not just black and white before, rich, poor. We have these kind of emerging countries, and they're filling the middle. And in those emerging countries, those developing countries, they've made a lot of progress, but they're not buying cars. They're not at that level of standard of living. They're buying bicycles in his representation, right? But they're very different from the countries on the far end of the spectrum on the left, who simply, their basic need was a pair of shoes. So we have this kind of emerging economies, these developing countries, these economies in transition. All right?
But the distance from the poorest here, the very poorest, to the very richest over here, is wider than ever. But there is a continuous world from walking, biking, driving, flying. There are people on all levels, and most people tend to be somewhere in the middle. This is the new world we have today, in 2010. And what will happen in the future? Well, I'm going to project into 2050. I was in Shanghai recently, and I listened to what's happening in China, and it's pretty sure that they will catch up, just as Japan did. All the projection. This one will grow with 1 to 2 or 3%, and this grows with 7, 8, and then they will land up here. They will start flying. And these lower middle income countries, the emerging countries, they will also forge forwards economically. And if, but only if, we invest in the right green technology so that we can avoid severe climate change and energy can still be relatively cheap, then they will move all the way up here. And they will start to buy electric cars. Isn't it? This is what we will find there. So what about the poorest 2 billion? What about the poorest 2 billion here? Will they move on? Well, here population comes in, because there we already have 2 to 3 children per woman, family planning is widely used, and population growth is coming to an end. Here population is growing. So these 2 billions will in the next decades increase to 3 billions, and they will thereafter increase to 4 billion. There is nothing but the nuclear war of a kind we've never seen that can stop this from happening. Because we already have this in process. But if And only if they get out of poverty, they get education, they get improved child survival, they can buy a bicycle and a cell phone and come here, then population growth will stop up there in 2050. We cannot have people on this level looking for food and shoes, because then we get continued population growth. And let me show you why. All
right, so let's stop there. 2050, the projection is that, and remember what he just showed us, he said if. So if we were to back up just a few seconds, so what is he saying about the right side of the spectrum? What's happening there on the right side, the higher income side of the spectrum?
Low population growth.
Okay, not seeing as much population growth there. And what else is happening? Those boxes shifted to the right. When he shifted those boxes in the middle to the right, what are we talking about? Okay, so we're seeing economic growth in this middle set of countries, these developing economies, right? And they're going to continue to make progress. So if the developing economies, those ones in the middle, continue to make progress, right? Those ones that maybe are sitting at kind of average world GDP per capita, if they continue to make progress, then, we're going to see them get a lot closer to the developed economies. But what about those boxes on the left? Who are they? Those are the underdeveloped countries. And what's happened to them?
Population's growing.
The population's growing, still seeing rapid population growth. But what else? Did those boxes move? Those boxes didn't move. So what is he suggesting?
They're not going to grow.
That we're not going to see, whatever these set of countries are, think about the poorest countries in the world, right? Are there countries, guys, with GDP per capita below $1,000? Yeah, plenty of them. You can find the poorest countries in the world. Do they look any better than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago? So what is he saying? In 2050, these countries have what? Not made any progress, right? They've not made any progress. Why haven't they made any progress? Okay, well, they're still thinking about their basic needs, but he didn't cover it in this video, but what have you learned about kind of success for development? What have you picked up in your econ classes that might suggest why some countries might grow and others might not? Institutions. Yeah, it has everything to do with institutions, right? If you have bad institutions, you're not a market economy. What about a planned economy? Is a planned economy going to grow like this? Probably not. What if you have really corrupt government? Do you see a lot of growth, successful growth in countries with really corrupt governments? No. So it's going to have a lot to do with institutions. These countries on the left are basically stagnant, right? They're not making any progress. And probably a lot of it has to do with institutions, right? So you covered that in your international econ class. All right.
Out of poverty, they get education, they get improved child survival, they can buy a bicycle and a cell phone and come here, then population growth will stop up there in 2050. We cannot have people on this level looking for food and shoes, because then we get continued population growth. And let me show you why, by converting back to the old-time digital technology. Here I have on the screen my country bubbles. Every bubble is a country, the size is population, the colors show the continent, the yellow one there is the Americas, dark blue is Africa, brown is Europe, green is Middle East, and this light blue is South Asia, that's India, and this is China, size is population. Here I have children per woman, 2 children, 4 children, 6 children, 8 children, big families, small families. The year is 1960, and down here child survival. The percentage of children surviving childhood up to starting school, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, and almost 100%, as we have today in the wealthiest and healthiest countries. Look, this is the world my teacher talked about in 1960. 1 billion Western world here, high child survival, small families, and all the rest, the rainbow of the developing countries, with very large families and poor child survival. What has happened? I start the world. Here we go. Can you see, as the year passed by, child survival is increasing. They get soap, hygiene, education, vaccination, penicillin, and then family planning. Family size is decreasing. They get up to 90% of child survival, then family is decreasing. Also the Arab countries in the Middle East is falling down there. Look, Bangladesh catching up with India. The whole emerging economy world joins the Western world with good child survival and small family size. But we still have the poorest billion. Can you see the poorest billion? Those boxes I had over here? They are still up here. And they still have a child survival of 70 to 80%, meaning that if you have 6 children born, there will be at least 4 who survive to the next generation. And the population will double in 1 generation. So the only way of really getting world population to stop is to continue to improve child survival to 90%. That's why investments by Gates Foundation, UNICEF and aid organization, together with national government in the poorest countries are so good. Because they are actually helping us to reach a sustainable population size of the world.
So guys, I wish he had shown you the whole thing full screen, and there's some other videos that will do that. But when he first looked at the world, so let's go back. Give me a good screen of it. All right, so 1960. What do we see? A whole bunch of countries with what? What's that upper left quadrant? Lots of children being born and lower child mortality, right? So that's that early stage we just talked about in the previous video, right? The early stage. But then, what direction do they move? First, they move which way? To the right, right? So I don't know if I'll be able to show you that to you, but we saw them, if we had been able to see this, they first started moving to the right. So we see that there, moving to the right. So at first everyone's moving to the right, not down. So what does that mean? What's happening?
Less children are dying.
Okay.
But you still create.
We still have the same number of births, right? We have the same number of births, but we're seeing child mortality rates fall, right? Child mortality rates fall. So the first stage, remember, in that transition, we start improving things, child mortality goes down, but we haven't adjusted our birth rates. Then what happens on this graph? Then which way do the bubbles move? Then they start to move down after child mortality rates have fallen. Then we adjust our birth rates, right? So that's that transition that we had talked about.
Emerging economy world joins the Western world with good child survival and small family size, but we still have the poorest billion. Can you see the poorest billion? Those boxes I had over here? They are still up here, and they still have a child survival of 70 to 80%, meaning that if you have 6 children born, there will be at least 4 who survive to the next generation, and the population will double in 1 generation. So the only way of really getting world population to stop is to continue to improve child survival to 90%. That's why investments by Gates Foundation, UNICEF and aid organization, together with national government in the poorest countries are so good. Because they are actually helping us to reach a sustainable population size of the world. We can stop at 9 billion if we do the right things. Child survival is the new green. It's only by child surviving that we will stop population growth. And will it happen? Well, I'm not an optimist. Neither am I a pessimist. I'm a very serious possibilist. It's a new category, where we take emotion apart and we just work analytically with the world. It can be done. We can have a much more just world with green technology and with investments to alleviate poverty and global governance. The world can become like this. And look at the position of the old West. Remember when this blue box was all alone, leading the world, living its own life? This will not happen. The role of the Old West in the New World is to become the foundation of the modern world. Nothing more, nothing less. But it's a very important role. Do it well and get used to it. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. It's loud. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the population growth in the United States is versus? Like,
Yeah, what's the population growth in the United
like
States?
how many births do we have per second?
I don't know the raw data, but the last time I looked it up, the population growth rate in the U.S. was 0.6 net population growth. So 0.6. But if you went to a lot of our developed counterparts, so Europe, it was closer to 0.1. And if you went to the developing countries, some were over 2, some were over 1.
So, like, do countries want to be at like 0?
Do countries want to be at 0? Countries don't want to be at 0. In fact, in Denmark, there's a big campaign, and it basically tells you to go have lots of sex. Why do they want you to have lots of sex? Because they need some babies. Because if your population shrinks, that's not a good thing. And some countries are experiencing negative population growth, right? 0 population growth can easily become negative population growth.
So what's like the goal? Like,
so what's the
is there a
goal?
goal of like a healthy growth rate?
I mean, I'm not sure that there's a generally accepted goal. You've got some people that argue 0 population growth. There are people that will argue small positive population growth. Brandon, you want to add to that?
Didn't China screw themselves because of the one-child rule?
Well, y'all are going to learn about China's one-child rule, and that's a great example. And China tried a really interesting experiment with their one-child policy, and you're going to be learning more about that for homework. And I wouldn't say, I don't want to characterize it as that they screwed themselves, because their population growth rate was something like 2.2, 2.3. It was too high. Did the one-child policy decrease population growth? Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on what your goal is. Could they have become the largest economy in the world, do you think, if they hadn't decreased their population growth? No. Would their standard of living have gone up? Now, it's not a rich country, and I don't want you to think China is a rich country, but their economic situation is way better than it used to be. Their standard of living is higher. That wouldn't have happened without getting population growth under control. However, as you guys point out, there were some serious unintended consequences that they might not have thought through. And you're going to be learning a little bit more about that. Yeah?
Do you think that they should have done, like, you know, you can only have 4 kids, then 3, then 2, something like that?
Do I think that they should have phased, do I think China should have phased in, lower limits? Yeah. I mean, I don't know. If you look at purely the growth rates in terms of their economy, if that's the only thing you cared about, and you don't care necessarily about how you're taking care of your retirees or gender imbalances or all that, they were successful in lowering or raising their standard of living. So I don't know, but they have certainly made some changes to their population policy, and you're going to learn about that for homework. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, because you'll learn. But it's a very interesting case study, and guys, you're going to have the opportunity to contrast it with Thailand. Thailand also is in the same situation. Thailand, when you read about Thailand, they had a very similar population growth rate. It was something like 2.3, very similar to China. Very different approach taken, though, and both have changed their situation. Probably one appeals to us more than others because we come from a country where we are used to our individual choice. All right. Another good hands throttling video. Hold on.
The evil of light once almost destroyed the world, and now it has returned. My children, they have power and vision. Transcendence.
Your family will fight as one.
I'm going to talk about religion, but it's a broad and very delicate subject, so I had to limit myself. And therefore I will limit myself to only talk about the links between religion and sexuality. No, this is a very serious talk. So I will talk of what I remember as the most wonderful. It's when the young couple whisper, tonight we're going to make a baby. My talk will be about the impact of religions on the number of babies per woman. This is indeed important because everyone understands that there is some sort of limit on how many people we can be on this planet. And there are some people who say that the world population is growing like this, 3 billion in 1960, 7 billion just last year, and it will continue to grow because there are religions that stops women from having few babies, and it may continue like this. To what extent are these people right? When I was born, there was less than 1 billion children in the world, and today, 2000, there's almost 2 billion. What has happened since? And what do the experts predict will happen with the number of children during this century? This is a quiz. What do you think? Do you think it will decrease to 1 billion? Will it remain the same and be 2 billion by the end of the century with the number of children increase here, children up to 15 years? Or will it continue in the same fast rate and be 4 billion children up there? I will tell you by the end of my speech, but now what does religion have to do with it? When you want to classify religion, it's more difficult than you think. You go to Wikipedia and the first map you find is this. It divides the world into Abrahamic religions and Eastern religion. But that's not detailed enough. So we went on and we looked in Wikipedia, we found this map. But that subdivides Christianity, Islam and Buddhism into many subgroups. So it was too detailed. Therefore at Gapminder we made our own map. And it looks like this. It is each country is a bubble. The size is the population, big China and big India here, and the color now is the majority religion. It's a religion where more than 50% of the people say that they belong. It's Eastern religion in India and China, in neighboring Asian countries. Islam is the majority religion all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, across the Middle East, Southern Europe, and through Asia, all the way to Indonesia. That's where we find Islam majority. And Christian majority religions we see in these countries, they are blue, and that is most countries in America and Europe, many countries in Africa, and a few in Asia. The white here are countries which cannot be classified because one religion does not reach 50%, or there is doubt about the data, or there are some other reasons. So we were careful with that. So bear with our simplicity now when I take you over to this chart. This is in 1960. And now I show the number of babies per woman here. 2, 4, or 6. Many babies, few babies. And here the income per person in comparable dollars. The reason for that is that many people say you have to get rich first before you get few babies. So low income here, high income there. And indeed in 1960 you had to be a rich Christian to have few babies. The exception was Japan. Japan here was regarded as an exception, otherwise it was only Christian countries. But there were also many Christian countries that had 6 to 7 babies per woman, but they were in Latin America or they were in Africa. And countries with Islam as majority religion, all of them almost had 6 to 7 children per woman, regardless of the income level. And all the Eastern religions except Japan have the same level. Now let's see what has happened in the world. I start the world, and here we go. 1962, can you see they're getting a little richer, but the number of babies per woman is falling. Look at China, they're falling fairly fast. And all the Muslim majority countries across the income are coming down, as do the Christian majority countries in the middle income range. And when we enter into this century, you find more than half the mankind down here. And by 2010, we are actually 80% of humans who live in countries with about 2 children per woman. It's a quite amazing development which have happened. And these are countries from United States here with $40,000 per capita. France, Russia, Iran, Mexico, Turkey, Algeria, Indonesia, India, and all the way to Bangladesh and Vietnam, which has less than 5% of the income per person in the United States and the same amount of babies per woman. I can tell you that the data on number of children per woman is surprisingly good in all countries. We get that from the census data. It's not one of these statistics which is very doubtful. So what we can conclude is you don't have to get rich to have few children. It has happened across the world. And then when we look at religions, we can see that the Eastern religions, indeed, there's not one single country with majority of that religion that has more than 3 children. Whereas with Islam as majority religion and Christianity, you see countries all the way, but there's no major difference. There's no major difference between these religions. There is a difference with income. The countries which has many babies per woman here, they have quite low income. Most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are also countries here like Guatemala, like Papua New Guinea, like Yemen and Afghanistan. Many think that Afghanistan here and Congo, which have suffered severe conflicts, that they don't have fast population growth. It's the other way around. In the world today, it's the countries that have the highest mortality rates that have the fastest population growth, because the death of a child is compensated by 1 more child. These countries have 6 children per woman. They have a sad death rate of 1 to 2 children per woman, but 30 years from now, Afghanistan will go from 30 million to 60 million. Congo will go from 60 to 120. That's where we have the fast population growth. And many think that all these countries, they are stagnant, but they are not. Let me compare Senegal, Muslim-dominated country, with a Christian-dominated country, Ghana. I take them backwards here to their independence when they were up here in the beginning of the 1960s. Just look what they have done. It's an amazing improvement. From 7 children per woman, they've gone all the way down to between 4 and 5. It's a tremendous improvement. So what does it take? Well, we know quite well what is needed in these countries. You need to have children to survive. You need to get out of the deepest poverty, so children are not of importance for work in the family. You need to have access to some family planning, and you need the 4th factor, which perhaps is the most important factor. But let me illustrate that 4th factor by looking at Qatar. Here we have Qatar today, and there we have Bangladesh today. If I take these countries back to the years of their independence, which is almost the same year, 71, 72, it's a quite amazing development which have happened. Look at Bangladesh and Qatar. With so different incomes, it's almost the same drop in number of babies per woman. And what is the reason in Qatar? Well, I do as I always do. I went to the Statistical Authority of Qatar, to their webpage. It's a very good webpage, I recommend it. And I looked up, oh yeah, you can have lots of fun here. And it's provided free of charge. I found Qatar social trends, very interesting, lots to read. I found fertility at birth, and I looked at total fertility rate per woman. These are the scholars and experts in the government agency in Qatar, and they say the most important factors are increased age at first marriage, increased educational level of Qatari women, and more women integrated in the labor force. I couldn't agree more. Science couldn't agree more. This is a country that indeed have gone through a very, very interesting modernization. So what it is these 4. Children should survive, children shouldn't be needed for work, women should get education and join the labor force, and family planning should be accessible.
All right, so let's stop there for a second. So before you frantically write this down, let's just make sure we understand what we've seen. So what did he show us in terms of the pattern over time? Which direction did the bubbles move? they moved down, and some moved, towards the right, a little bit higher income. He made a good example when he compared, what was his comparison? It was Bangladesh and Qatar, right? He just showed us Bangladesh versus Qatar. So let's see if we can go back to that graph. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it. All right, so Bangladesh, there we go. Senegal, this one's the same thing. Senegal versus Ghana. So what are we seeing? Decreases, right? And falling, really kind of decreasing more than shifting to the right. They've seen some income increases, right? Some economic growth, but relatively poor countries, right? Relatively poor countries, and they see the same pattern. So what was his point when he compared Bangladesh versus Qatar? Bangladesh versus Qatar. What do we know about those two countries? Yes.
It says you don't have to get rich to have fewer children.
Okay, but what do we know about Bangladesh versus Qatar? Qatar is really, really rich, and Bangladesh is really, really poor, right? But yet we see the same pattern, right? See the same pattern. So what's the punchline? What's his punchline there, guys?
You can decrease the babies per woman without increasing income.
Yeah, that this isn't related to religion. It's not necessarily related to income, right? There's some correlation probably. Instead, it has to do with kind of some structural things, and most specifically, what has to happen to infant mortality? It has to, right, decrease so that people stop having as many babies, right? So getting to that phase 2, right? All right, so let's go back to the list of things he says are important kind of structurally in your society. So, number 1, you need children to survive, right? So that's the most important thing he's really been talking about, that we need to see a decrease in infant mortality, because when we have high infant mortality, what do? We have more babies, right? So we need children to survive. The second thing, many children aren't needed for work. What is he talking about there? Many children aren't needed for work?
To get out of poverty.
Okay, but what is he talking about specifically here?
Family, like
Why would people have a lot of children? What does this have to do with families having a lot of kids?
would families have them use them for
Because it was a built-in labor source, right? It was a built-in labor source. So you have to be kind of in a structural sense where you've got a labor force. You don't need to have a whole lot of children to provide your own labor force. Third, women get an education and they join the labor force. What do you think that would do to birth rates? Women go to work, they get educated to go to work, birth rates fall. And of course, family planning is accessible. So we're talking about access to contraception, women having ways to not have babies. Guys, you won't believe me, but in the developing world, fathers often want to have big families. Why would fathers want to have big families?
Carry on the family name.
Kind of carry on the family name. It's a sense of kind of machismo, right? I've talked to women that do not want to have any more babies, but their husband wants to have more and more babies. The women don't want to have the babies. But if you don't have access to birth control, or if it's against your religion, or if your husband's going to get mad if he finds you on birth control, you can imagine the problems. So family planning has to be accessible, and it also has to be accepted, right? It has to be kind of accepted. All right, let's continue.
So what it is these 4. Children should survive, children shouldn't be needed for work, women should get education and join the labor force, and family planning should be accessible. Now, look again at this. The average number of children in the world is like in Colombia, it's 2.4 today. There are countries up here which are very poor, and that's where family planning, better child survival is needed. I strongly recommend Melinda Gates' last TED Talk. And here down, there are many countries which are less than 2 children per woman. So when I go back now to give you the answer of the quiz, it's 2. We have reached peak child. The number of children is not growing any longer in the world. We are still debating peak oil, but we have definitely reached peak child. And the world population will stop growing. The United Nations Population Division has said they will stop growing at 10 billion. But why do they grow if the number of children doesn't grow? Well, I will show you here. I will use these card boxes in which your notebooks came. They are quite useful for educational purposes. Each card box is 1 billion people. And there are 2 billion children in the world. There are 2 billion young people between 15 and 30. These are round in number. Then there is 1 billion between 30 and 45, almost 1 between 45 and 60, and then it's my box. This is me, 60 plus. We are here on top. So what will happen now is what we call the big fill-up.
Okay, so guys, does everyone understand what he's about to illustrate? So he's convinced us that we've reached this maximum peak in children per family, right, of 2. But he wants to figure out if we're just replacing ourselves, right? If my husband and I have 2 children, we're replacing ourselves. Why is it if we're just replacing ourselves, is the world population continuing to rise for a period of time before it levels out at 10? And what he's about to explain to us is called the great fill-up. So he's about to illustrate with his boxes the great fill-up, illustrating the reason that our population is going to continue to grow even though we've reached this kind of maximum of average 2 children per household.
You can see that it's like 3 billion missing here. They are not missing because they've died. They were never born. Because before 1980 there was much fewer people born than there were during the last 30 years. So what will happen now is quite straightforward. The old, sadly, we will die. The rest of you will grow older and you will get 2 billion children. Then the old will die. The rest will grow older and get 2 billion children. And then again the old will die and you will get 2 billion children. This is the great fill-up. It's inevitable. And can you see that this increase took place without life getting longer and without adding children? Religion has very little to do with the number of babies per woman. All the religions in the world are fully capable to maintain their values and adapt to this new world. And we will be just 10 billion in this world if the poorest people get out of poverty, their children survive, they get access to family planning. That is needed. But it's inevitable that we will be 2 to 3 billion more. So when you discuss and when you plan for the resources and the energy needed for the future for human beings on this planet, you have to plan for 10 billions. Thank you very much.
All right. So let's get started on this one. I think this one is short.
This is a very important question to get right because it was absolutely key for me. When our foundation first started up, it was focused on reproductive health. That was the main thing we did because I thought, population growth in poor countries is the biggest problem they face. You've got to help mothers who want to limit family size have the tools and education to do that. And I thought that's the only thing that really counts. Well, then I came across articles that showed that the key thing you can do to reduce population growth is actually improve health. And that sounds paradoxical. You think, okay, better health means more kids, not less kids. Well, in fact, what parents are doing is they're trying to have 2 kids survive to adulthood to take care of them. And so the more disease burden there is, the more kids they have to have that high probability. So there's a perfect correlation that as you improve health, within a half generation, the population growth rate goes down. In fact, Hans Rosling here at this conference, in 2 of my favorite speeches, actually showed that unbelievable correlation that population growth has gone down. Today, where is their high population growth? It's in the places with the worst health conditions, northern Nigeria, northern India. And so the two problems go exactly hand in hand. If we improve health rapidly, we will get the peak population to be as much as 1 billion below the current expected peak. That is about 8.3 billion versus 9.3.
$10 billion over the next 10 years.
He basically summarized the same thing. Hold on a
What does
second.
that mean exactly?
So he basically summarized the same thing that Hans Rosling was saying. So, give it to me in a nutshell. What's he saying? What's he saying?
Decrease like disease rates and help them be healthier overall and have less babies.
All right, so remember Bill Gates was saying when they started the Gates Foundation, what was their initial primary focus? Reproductive health, right? Reproductive health. So focusing on, women and pregnancy. But then they decided that that really wasn't broad enough. They needed to focus on what? Overall health, because there is a correlation, right? There's a correlation. So what is that correlation? What is that correlation, Lexi?
If you improve the health, then the growth rate will go down.
Improved health generates decreases in population growth rate. It's not only maternal health, right? It's not only reproductive health. So, where do we need to be focusing then? In those poorest areas that still have lack of health care, right? They still have poor sanitation. And those are the ones we're seeing high population growth. So we can make some headway. And Bill Gates is suggesting, kind of like Hans Rosling was suggesting, that the population is going to continue to grow, but if we focus on those areas of the globe faster, more, we might be able to curtail population at what? He's saying maybe in the 8-something billion people, not even having to worry about 10 billion people. Because remember, Hans Rosling was saying we're going to get to 10 billion people, but he kept saying if these boxes at the low income end, if we could do these things, we could change the dynamic. All right, we're going to stop there, guys, and we'll continue this next class period. Remember to read your announcements.
You finished that about that.